How you all doing, comrades? My name is Rev Comrade Rowley, and welcome to CLACCA ULC Homegroup Bible Studies. Um, generally speaking, we normally talk about the liberation hermeneutics of the text behind, within, and in front of the text. Today, we're primarily focusing on Genesis 29, and essentially, as previously before we um, think that Moses is probably the author. In terms of the timeline, um, the timeline could be as old as 50,000 years old, according to Aboriginal people. So there's not necessarily a clarity in terms of the timeline line. That much is for certain. But essentially, behind the text in this account, in this J account, Jacob meets their future spouse, and at the well meets their future spouse at the well near Haran, and this episode echoes similar ones in chapter 24 of the marriage of Isaac and Rebecca, and in Exodus 2:15-21, Moses and Zipporah. And like Moses, Jacob performs a heroic deed for their future spouse, rolling away the huge stone over the well's mouth to water their flocks. This act portrays Jacob as physically strong and as an agent of fertility, a role their masters, a role that a role Jacob masters at Haran. There is a dense repetition of kinship language in this passage, emphasizing Jacob's journey to the patriarchal kin and the likelihood of a proper marriage. Kinship words such as words in relation to the specification of the gender of siblings, such as brothers, sons, daughters, fathers, mothers, sister, occur often after verse 4. And Jacob's parent brother, Laban, occurs 3 times in verse 10, where Jacob saw Rachel. The encounters of Jacob with kin are sealed by kisses and hugs and weeping, and my bone and my flesh stresses the importance of the kinship bond. The parents' kinsmen, Jacob and Rachel are related on their father's side, although through Abraham and Nabal. But on the other hand, they're also related on the mother's side. So Rebecca, in relation to the term Rebecca ran, is a combination of terms that recalls Rebecca's virtuous haste. In verse 15 to 30, as Jay continues, the happy union of the kin is complicated by Jacob's betrothal to Rachel, and the younger of Laban's 2 daughters. The issues of rights of the firstborn, trickery between the parent and the child, divisions in who loves whom, and even the ability to see the story of the deception of Isaac in chapter 27, and the time the roles, but only this time the roles are reversed, and Jacob becomes a trickster, tricked, paying a price for their previous deeds. Jacob is deceived by the parent-in-law into marrying the firstborn daughter because Jacob cannot see who Rebecca is during the um, who she is during the night. Now, it's not necessarily poetic justice, but it's often assumed. It's could be compared to um, the experience many transgender folks, the experience that many transgender folks go through is through in cisgender folks automatically assuming assigning biological anatomy and so I think that it's important um, it's important not to assign biological anatomy to the characters. What is important here um, is the fact that Lebanon's resonant reply to Jacob upon this uh, d- discovery makes the relationship between the two clear. Laban prevails by marrying off um, both daughters to Jacob, and the firstborn and then the younger, and receiving 14 years labour for the bride price twice that Jacob had bargained for. The issue of the rights of the firstborn is introduced by the aside about Laban's daughters with the contrast of elder and younger. The physical contrast between the two daughters brings up the issue of sight. Leah's eyes were lovely, or perhaps weak, but Rachel was graceful and beautiful. Like Sarah and Rebecca, Jacob loved Rachel, echoes Isaac's love for Rebecca, and the depth of Jacob's love for Rachel makes the 7 years of labour but a few days. This is a rare expression of romantic love in the Bible, outside of the Song of Solomon, and its intensity will extend to the children Joseph and Benjamin after Rachel's death. In verse 29-30, they loved Rachel more than Leah, an ominous statement leading to God's response in verse 31 and the intense rivalry between the two spouses. The birth of Jacob's um, this story in the last part of the chapter from chapter 29 no, 9:31 right up to 35 leads into the birth of Jacob's 12 children in Haran, and is coloured by the barrenness of Rachel and the rivalry of the spouses, recalling the relationship of Sarah and Hagar. Like Abraham, Jacob is the rather passive figure in this domestic tale. The spouses are major agents, conceiving, naming the children, and even negotiating over Jacob's services. What's important to realize here is that names and biological anatomy matter in terms of the identity of the children um, cannot necessarily be determined by biological anatomy. And so I think that it's important to realize that regardless of the sexuality or gender, regardless of the sexuality or gender of the spouses and the children, children, this particular passage, the real injustice that is happening, the real injustice um, that is happening here is the fact that there were multiple marriages going on with the same children, and that in no way, shape, or form, what the text is really addressing is um, the deception, the deception of um, marrying somebody else that you don't necessarily love. Marrying somebody else that you don't necessarily love, and the deception of and the sibling rivalry was caused by the fact that um, two children that one man married two women, and it was not a consented. It was not a consented marriage between the parties, and so that's what caused the sibling that's what caused the sibling rivalry. Right. Um, Within the text, we can clearly see that um, this story is broken up into two parts. The first part is in relation to Jacob's meeting with Rachel, and the second part is in relation to Jacob marrying two of Laban's daughters. Daughters, but each didn't know. No, but what wound up ultimately what wound up winning out in the end, and is even though Jacob was tricked, even though Jacob was tricked, Jacob knew um, Jacob knew that um, tricked into marrying the wrong one one Jacob could not separate his love from the real one that he loved. Love and while there was no justification for the deception that occurred, um, however, however, this particular passage, um, in no way, shape, or form, it's in no way, shape, or form does not re-emphasize. It is not against transgender folk. Is not against healthy marriages and healthy relationships between transgender folks, and no way, shape, or um, but the real issue within the story is multiple marriages, multiple marriages occurring, um, and um, nobody, both partners not knowing, not knowing, and that's the difference. Difference, and so that's the real sin. The sin is the fact that they were deceived into accepting the fact that Jacob was deceived in marrying into marrying multiple daughters um, was was not necessarily mutually consented, and um, in no way, shape, or form, it's not a story. It's not a story that is against mutually loving, respectful, full relationships between partners. But the real sin here, is the fact that the marriages to the two daughters, the poly daughters, it was neither partner knew, and so that's a deception. I hope I have been able to clearly explain the real deception in this passage, and I think that it's important to um, when you're addressing passages like this, and you hear kinship terms, I think it's sometimes uh, helpful to set aside the biological anatomy, bio, biological anatomy terms, and address the real injustice that was going on here. And the real injustice that went on here is the fact that multiple marriages occurred, and neither of the daughters knew, and it wasn't consented. It's centered, and so that's the deception, and that was the problem with this particular polyamorous marriage. Um, Again, I hope I have been able to concretely address it. That's all for home group Bible studies for now. Just to let people know, School of Discipleship. School of Discipleship is coming um, up at the beginning of July. And so, what we're going to do is we're going to be moving home group Bible studies. Uh, 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 we're going to be moving home group Bible studies to a weeknight, or possibly be pre-recording this. But regardless, worse. But so stay tuned for further details on this. This. Thank you very much for joining us. That's all for now, and I will see you for 5 o'clock church. Bye for now.